So I got thinking about this guy Solomon in the Bible. Now, one of the interesting things about Solomon is when you're reading the Bible, you see basically when it comes to God's will for the his people, Israel, Solomon was like the pinnacle. I mean, you had David, great man, but definitely liked fighting. And God said, "There's no way I'm gonna let you build my temple. There's no way I'm gonna let you do any of this stuff. You got way too much blood on your hands, but your son's gonna do it." So I started thinking about Solomon, and I was reading through First Kings, and I found this really interesting scripture in First Kings, and it's chapter 9, verse 15, and it uses the word. Here's the account of the forced labor used to build the temple of the Lord, and I kind of got stopped on that because sometimes it's easy to read through things in the Bible and not really think about what you're reading, and I'm trying not to do that anymore. I'm trying to stop and read it and just, you can't just take the Bible for what it is and just say, okay, well, I believe in the Bible and blah, 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 but you never really actually look into it. You never read it. You never dig into it. And then when somebody questions you about it, you seem like an idiot because you have no idea what they're talking about. And one of the things I've heard people say is, well, was the Bible talking about slaves? And, here's one of them, forced labor, slaves. And it kind of caught my attention. It's like, okay, so Solomon used slaves to build God's temple. And I had to stop because the irony just kind of shook me here for a second. Like, wait a second. Whoa. God, the God of Israel, the God that Israel cried out to free them from their oppressors. When you read the story in the Bible, you see from the very beginning, they were slaves to Egypt. They were in Egypt, they were slaves, and they were being forced to build these temples for their gods, the Egyptian gods, Ra and all these other guys. And they cried out to God and said, God, deliver us. And God sent Moses and set them free from Egypt. And they left Egypt, left the Pharaoh with all of his oppression and got out of there. And God brought them into this promised land. And this land that he said, he goes, when you get there, he goes, you're gonna be blessed, you're gonna be taken care of, you're gonna have, all these amazing things. You're gonna have days of heaven on earth. He goes, but remember where you came from. Remember the reason that I'm giving you all of these good things. It's not for you to just go and, hey, look, I'm rich now. Hey, look, I'm blessed. Hey, look, this is great. But remember that God's will is to free people and to set people free and to help the oppressed, to help the widows, to help the orphans, to help those in need, to help the sick. That's God. That's who God is. God is the God of the sick, the oppressed, the orphans, the widows. He made that very clear all through the Bible. And he said, when you get into this new land, don't forget about that you're freed slaves, that at one time you were slaves to the Egyptians, but now you're free. So time goes on, and eventually here we go. We've got Solomon, the one that was supposed to be, in some ways, when the Old Testament scholars were looking through the scriptures and they were looking for this Messiah, they looked at Solomon as being this image of the Messiah, but they were totally wrong. Because here you see Solomon, even though he was so wise, he'd fallen back into the same pattern that the pharaohs of Egypt and all these other people had. They had all these great things, and then they forgot where they came from. And then the Israelites, even though they were freed slaves, they had become the oppressors. They had become the slave masters. And they were using slaves to build the temple of God. They've totally forgot where they came from. And I read this and I see it's like, gosh, God gave them all this wealth, gave them all these things to help people out, and they didn't do what God wanted them to do. Instead, they wanted to build this great, massive temple using slave labor. Now, the sad thing about it is, when I read that, I see that's how religion is. Religion requires slaves to build something, and that's not what God is about. If you feel like you're a slave to your religion, dump it, get rid of it. If you feel like you're a slave to going to church, stop going to church. Stop going to your church. Honestly, it's stupid. That's not what Jesus is all about. Jesus came to set us free. And not to build some kingdom here on earth, and not to build some, have us build this giant temple and be a slave to it. No. But see, I see Solomon here, and I see him becoming the Pharaoh, oppressing people, this forced labor, to build a temple for God, which is ironic. Now, and then you kind of go a little bit further and you see he starts mentioning these other cities. He built his own house using slaves, which is horrible. And then he also, with forced labor, built these different cities. And I started looking into these cities and I said, well, what were these cities? And you read these three different cities here in First Kings and chapter 9, and they're basically, they're fortified cities. They're cities that were his chariot cities, where he kept his chariots, where he kept his, all of his stuff for war. It were cities that were the forts to hold off all of the people who would try to come in and take this massive wealth that he'd acquired, which is hilarious because God never told him to do that. So he's using slaves, because it's requiring slaves, to be able to protect all the wealth that he has, that he's using for the wrong reasons, basically to become this giant warlord. So the title of this today is Solomon the Warlord, and he's totally missed out on what God meant for him to do. And you see this, it's funny because when you read where he got the chariots from in 1 Kings chapter 10, you get the chariots from Egypt. Solomon's becoming the next Pharaoh. The Israelites are becoming the Egyptians, and they're oppressing people. You see, why? Because they forgot. God told them not to forget where they came from. They were this great world power that was meant to bring peace to the world, and instead they brought war. Kind of sounds familiar. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to offend you, but when I read the story of Solomon, I see America. I see that we amass this great wealth that's meant to help out people, and instead we use this wealth to build bigger armies and start bigger, huge, gigantic, massive campaigns that go all across the world, and we put our nose in everybody else's business, and we think that we're making it a better place, and we're not. We've forgotten where we came from. We forgot that we are freed slaves. That we were people that were under the tyranny of England and not being able to worship and to live the way we wanted to. We broke free from that. And instead of remembering that, we forgot. And we are becoming the tyrants. And I see Solomon, and I see him using this wealth to become this giant warlord. And you see that it says that he imported and exported the chariots and the horses and all these different things. He became basically an arms dealer. His life no longer was about serving God and helping out the oppressed. It was about becoming this giant warlord. And in reading this, I realize, it finishes up with this. Solomon, it says his heart was not fully devoted to God. And that's the problem. America originally set out to become a country of freedom. That we were going to be the beacon of hope of this freedom. One of the major things was freedom of religion. We wanted people to have the right to worship however they wanted to. And I think it's ridiculous that we've become exactly the opposite. That we push this from freedom of religion to, well, you get freedom when it's only the religion that we like, which most of the time is atheism, or actually anti-theism. We're not going to allow you to pray. We're not going to allow you to do something, whatever. I'm not going to get on that rant right now. But ultimately, when you step back and look, you say, wow, how have we fallen so far from what God originally intended for us? To not be a bunch of hypocrites, to not be a bunch of idiots that, xenophobes and just so afraid of what's outside and think that our way is the only way, and forcing that on the rest of the world instead of stepping back and thinking about it. So Solomon becomes this warlord, and Solomon, it says his heart's not fully devoted to God, and ultimately Solomon dies, and his kingdom is split, and chaos, and eventually here comes Babylon, here comes the Persians, here comes all these different armies, they come, and Israel ends up being slaves once again. And then you have Jesus stepping on the scene, and he's speaking to freed slaves that are under the oppression of Rome, and he tells them, this is what's amazing: blessed are the peacemakers. If I don't leave you with any other thought, get a hold of this. Jesus was about freeing people. God is a God of freed slaves. God is a God that wants to help the oppressed, help those that are in need. And Jesus came to a people who were freed slaves, but now they're oppressed by the Romans. And he says, love your enemies. Pray for those that persecute you. Turn the other cheek. If they ask you for your coat, give them your tunic. If they steal this, give it to them. Who cares? If they ask you to go a mile, go with them too. Do not resist. You don't resist evil with evil. Fighting against it is not going to make the difference. It's going to come from something within. It's going to come from a change inside of you. And I believe that the only way that our country, the only way that we're going to make this any better is when we decide to change. Don't forget where you came from. Don't forget that you were once under the tyranny of sin, that you were once under the power of the enemy, of the devil. And when God set you free, he set you free for a reason. He set you free not so that you can just fall in line like every other patriot and think that, God and country and blah, 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 and all that kind of garbage. No, he gave you that freedom to be able to look past all this stuff, look past the kingdoms of this world, look past all these things and realize that you're going to be blessed when you're the peacemakers. You're going to be blessed when you bring peace. You're going to be blessed when you help out the widows, the orphans, those in need, people that are sick, people that are oppressed, praying for those who persecute you, praying for other people that need your help, and going out and helping these people. That's what makes the difference. Don't forget where you came from.